Is your phone battery?
I just thought maybe.
Do you want to start?
Hey, what's up? It's Big Dog and Taylor. Okay, so we're going to start with a little story. I posted a TikTok video today. I feel so like a Gen Z, or almost, it feels that way sometimes. Like I'm old now. I feel like I'm old now, but maybe not. Basically, there's this video going around where it's like, show me how you had low expectations for men and how you don't now, and what's changed. And like, essentially, like you talk about how your partner does something that has like dramatically changed and shifted the way that men, like you view men. And so I went along and I just started sharing all of these things that Taylor does on a regular basis. Things like the simplicity of me never touching a door handle and just him being a gentleman all the time. And then the deeper things where like we're making goals and he's constantly pushing me to pursue those goals, and he's praying over me, and he's walking with me, and he's there in the really hard things, and he's just constantly holding space for me. And people in their singleness trying to figure out what they needed to do in order to attract this partner, what they needed to do in order to be the best version of themselves, and all of these things. And so I came to Taylor and I said, we should really talk about singleness and what that looks like and how like special that time is actually, because there's so much that you can find out about yourself. There's so much that you can learn about yourself, and there's so much that you actually need to do. It's a requirement to figure out, so that when you do get into the right relationship, you can show up in a correct way. So we're going to talk about singleness, and then we're also going to talk about the dating world today and what that kind of was like.
I love it. No, I'm excited because I think it's very applicable to basically, that's the start of any relationship, right? Anything, obviously dating is the first piece to any long-term relationship. You have to go through that phase. And then 2, you have to go through singleness usually to get to a point where you're in a relationship. So everybody's going to deal with it. Everybody's going to have to go through that space. So why not talk about it? So I think it's really good. So is there a point you want to hit on first or no?
Let's just go with standards, because a lot of like what I was talking about in my video was I'm very forward about like the things that I've gone through in my life. And one of them was a harder relationship. And it's because a lot of the times, like when I walked into that relationship, my standards I didn't have any standards. I didn't know. I was only using what I had viewed in previous relationships or watching older couples or whatever. And I took that into the relationship I had, and it wasn't very helpful. So we wanted to just talk about what those standards kind of look like.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the biggest things, you kind of hit on it too, is we have to realize that every time we're in a relationship, it's typically going to be based upon our history and how we've seen relationships, what we've been around, and what we're either trying to emulate or trying to distance ourselves from, right? It could be any one of those things. Most of the time, it's usually trying to emulate what is common to us or what we've seen, because that's what's normal, right? So if we don't like how things have been, that's a totally different avenue, and you kind of avoid in that regard. But we have to really take time. And I think that's why singleness is important, is because you should take that time to figure out what you really want. Take that time to really figure out, what am I really after? What kind of person do I want to become and be in a relationship before I even bring someone else in, right? And then when someone else comes in, what does that look like? What do I want them to be like? How do I want them to mesh with me? All this kind of stuff. And you have to really question and ask the thing of why. Like, why do I want that? Is it just because that's what I've always seen? And because I've always seen that, do I actually like that? Or is that just the thing that's how our relationships are supposed to be? Right? And so you can limit a relationship based upon your previous experiences, whether it be personal or as a bystander watching. Because a lot of times, until you really see someone living out something like, oh, I love that, that really never becomes an actual thing like, oh, that's possible, then I want that too, right? And once we get to that opening space, it really opens up the door to that. And that's, you have to really maneuver. That's why I think singleness is that space where you kind of get to realize like, this is the standard I have. This isn't being created. This is not what I really want. It allows you to really know what you're going after, because in relationships, it's so easy to get tossed in one way or the other through emotions and all that kind of stuff. And it's really easy to make sometimes bad decisions to be in relationships, or bad decisions to leave relationships when actually it's something you really do want. So there's both sides of it for sure. I think it's more staying in relationships that you probably shouldn't be in is more the actual likely result, just because that's a lot more common. But I think it's really important. You have to understand why and where is it coming from. Because if I see where it's coming from, then I can see like, it's just in my subconscious, but why is that there? Is it something that I want there? Or what do I need to reprogram so that when I bring somebody in my life, then I'm actually creating what I do want, not just what's normal, what I've always had, what I've always seen.
Yeah, and I like that you touched on the fact that we have these standards and we place them and we write them down and we're very, very clear on them so that when we do show up in the relationship, if it's not like the person has to be perfect and they don't have room for mistakes, they don't have room to learn, because we need to understand that we're going to show up and we're constantly going to be learning ourselves. But if our standards are clear and our boundaries are clear and we know what we want on like the basis of how we want to be treated and what that looks like, we'll know much clearer and much faster when to walk away.
Right. It goes back to what I always tell you too, and we've talked about before. It's like, it's commitment over feeling, right? Mm-hmm. It's commitment before feeling. And when you have standards, those standards are commitments that you're sticking to before any feelings get involved, right? So if it's, I'm committed to, because really when our standards are tied to some piece of our identity, which we'll probably touch on at some point, and we always keep our identity, right? Otherwise we lose our mind. So if those standards are tied to that, this is what I want, this is who I am, so forth, then now that becomes the baseline to, if it's not that, it's easier to walk away because now we're committed to being ourselves. And so when it's not ourselves or not what we're truly going after, it's easy to say no. And because there's more emotion on the commitment than there is in the feeling of like, oh, they're cute. Mm-hmm. They make me laugh. I had fun. Like, that's so surface level. Those are great things. Don't get me wrong.
Great beginning things.
Right. Yeah. Well, you want to laugh forever and stuff.
I mean, yes, I know.
But the idea of it being like,
you definitely will. You're welcome.
Basically, the idea of understanding that, because if you don't, then that commitment level is going to be predicated or led by feelings instead of truly being on point of, okay, if I know this is what I want and it's not, it's a lot easier for me to leave because I have so much feelings and backing behind this commitment versus me going and be like, I'm just going to see how it goes. I really don't have an expectation. Then you're really letting the other person set whatever that is.
Yeah.
Instead of you coming in like, okay, cool. Like I'm maneuvering between all of this. Yeah, you're going to go in and have fun and leave an open mind. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is when you know things aren't right, don't let it sit there and just like, oh, we'll just see how it goes. If when you know, right? Because the longer time you stay in it, it's going to be harder to get out.
Yeah. But, on the other side though, sometimes your knowing may get twisted with...
That's a good point.
Do you know what I'm going to say? Yeah. Your knowing gets twisted with this normalization of how you think that you should be treated based on how you've been treated before.
Right.
And so you can't decipher what the truth is and what you are worthy of. And now you're taking the circumstances of, oh, I'm really care about this person, but they treat me this way and I really like them. So I'm willing to give up the pieces of the things that I deserve, that I think I'm supposed to have in this relationship, because there's a feeling that's so strong, but the feeling is only strong because it feels like the thing that you had your whole life based on old relationships.
Right. That's a good point. And I think it's literally one or the other, and that's the spectrum, right? It's like, is it based upon my previous experiences and things? Because sometimes what we've known or what we've grown up knowing may not be right. Mm-hmm. Or it may be right and the other person's not right, right? So that's where that space of like figuring out why and what I want is so important, is because now you're bringing two worlds that came up and been brought up differently together and expecting you both to be on the exact same page with certain things. That's not always the case, right? And so you're having to decipher all of that is important. But I think it is, it's a good understanding to have it could be one or the other. And sometimes you do give it a chance because you're like, okay, this is not normal. It's not what I'm used to, but I like it and I think it's good. And just because doesn't seem right doesn't mean I can't continue on that. And just because it wasn't a standard before doesn't mean it can't be a standard now. If it causes you to raise your standard or change the standard a little bit. I think it's more of like when you know it's not something, don't negotiate that, right? But I think if just because it's not normal or not, you haven't seen it before, then I'm not saying don't give it a chance. That's a good point she brings up. So
yeah, definitely. So another thing that I kind of wanted to talk on with the singleness is just like, what does that look like then to be very aware? Like, how do you find out when you're like, because when you're in something, you can only see so far. So how do you take a step back and actually see, okay, and I'm asking for you and for people to question themselves, like, what are the things that I'm accepting? Like, how can I diagnose the relationships that I've seen firsthand and how I'm bringing them into the relationships that I'm asking or letting in now? And so, like, what are some of the things that you did when you were in your singleness? Because a lot of the things that you did without me are benefiting me greatly now with me. So I think it's important for everybody to know.
I love that one. And one thing I will say with this is a tip, like a practical thing you can do is to always appreciate the other person when they do something that you do appreciate. A lot of times we leave things nonverbal and we don't say it, but we're like, man, that made me feel really good. I really appreciate you saying that, but we never say that out loud. And how do you expect them to know you feel appreciated if you never tell them? Example right now, the reason I brought that up is because I appreciate that and saying those things, right? Because just because you think of them doesn't mean the other person knows them. Yeah. And even if you told them before, it doesn't mean that they can't forget or they forget the feeling. So constantly doing it. So what I'm saying with that is like, I appreciate it. I just want to explain that because when I say I appreciate that, it's a constant thing. It's not just once, or not twice, not just on camera. It's all the time. And I think you can agree. Definitely. That's how I do it all the time because it's important to make sure the other person, they know what you do appreciate and it keeps everything in alignment the way we want. And then I know where to hit the mark. Right. So like I know certain things that you like, certain foods, like certain things that I do that are really small and I know that you like them. And so I'm intentional about doing them. And then the second thing I was going to say is like we do this thing now where it's not all the time, obviously, because we're not going to be like overwhelming with it. But if we're doing something and I randomly am like, I love you, or you say, I love you, we're like, hey, why do you say that? Like, I love you too, but why do you say that? And we do it in like a way because we want to hear what goes on in that our mind at that point. And it sounds silly, but it's actually like once we verbalize it, it's like, why did I say that? And it's like, oh, I'm saying it because you just did this and I just realized that this and like beautiful things come from it. And okay, but then back to that's a good point to keep hitting on because it is something so it seems very small, but like it's so common for like, I love you too. And the conversation ends and you move on. But if the other person just says it randomly, let's say, or just in general, it's like, why do you love me? Like, what makes you say you love me right now? Yeah. Like, because something had to come to your mind in order for you to say that. So tell me what that thing was. Because now, one, it helps the person verbalize that and they know that they are on the same page with the feeling and they can verbalize that feeling. It's like, oh, like you were thinking about blank, 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 blank. And allows them to get on the same page, one. But then two, it affirms that the feeling is like what they're not just saying it out of habit, they're saying it out of intention. Because most of the time, if it's truly meaning, because a lot of times too, like we can get in the habit of just saying I love you and not tagging like that. It's just because it's just a habit, right? It's just like, oh, I'm just saying, I should say I love you, I haven't said it in a while. Like that's not how it should be. There should be an intention behind it. And so to call it out, one, and then two, for the other person to really realize, oh, like, yeah, then they love that why you love them again. And it gets reaffirmed all the time. And it's constant about reaffirming it all the time. And so I think that's a good point. Little trick there that I think you can throw to anybody can use. But I think where we left off was like the awareness of like what were the things that you did and that you thought about that you wanted in a relationship to prepare yourself for the one with me. Got it. There's a bunch of things, but I'll try to pick a few. I think kind of, we talked about a little bit on a podcast before this. Whenever you finish a relationship, a prior one or whatever, you have to decipher everything between it about yourself, how you were, why you were, what does that mean? Because the biggest thing I think is you have to understand, and what I mean by decipher the belief systems about relationships, about how you view them, what you truly want. And that's kind of how we led with that, is because it is important to understand like how you view that and how you view you in it, right? And so when you truly understand yourself and why you respond a certain way, why all these different things, you start to understand what's not only good for you, but you understand yourself so you can not fall into traps anymore. That's the first thing. And then two, I'm a huge proponent, and we've talked about before, is if you want a level 10 person, you have to be a level 10, right? And it's the idea of like, whatever I want, I'm going to attract, because everybody wants the best version, right? But sometimes we're not the person we need to be to attract that person. So it really goes down to like, I've got to grow myself. I've got to focus on me for right now until that person comes. Because I think a lot of times we're out seeking, and we're seeking externally rather than internally. It needs to shift a little bit, right? Instead of looking out like, who can I go and meet? Who can I bring into my life? It's more of like, okay, I need to go work on me. Like, I need to create a life internally that's beautiful, because no one's going to solve my internal mess, right? And that's what we think. We're going to bring someone in that's going to make my life better. Yes, it can, but it's not going to fix your personal problems, right? It's not going to fix everything that you're going through. They can help in that, but that's also can detract in that relationship itself as well, because there's a lot of things that they can't really do for you, but they want to. And then that causes a lot of things that it's just hard. So when you spend time with yourself and you spend time with being that person, because think about it, long term, everybody in the beginning of dating, which we'll get into a little bit, everybody puts their best foot forward for as long as they can, right? They put their best foot forward as long as they can. And then as relationship starts going, you start to figure out who they really are. And then when you start figuring out who they really are, that's usually when you're like, okay, the things are clear a little bit. And are they who they say they are? Are they continuing to do this? Is it a constant? Is it a commitment deal? Like, are they still being that person, or are they just acting because they were attracted to me and they want me?
And just to touch on this, oftentimes we're so full in our emotions by that time when we start seeing the truth that we're not able to step away because we weren't willing to see it earlier.
Right. Which I think is why, even like we talked about the questions and asking legitimate questions, pierces through those emotions early on, because they're real. And then you have emotions with those, but it kind of dissipates all of the like the playing the game kind of emotions, right? It gets to the real feelings, if you will. But I think that part is important. What I was saying is the idea of like understanding that going into it is vital. And I think you can do that while you're single, because it does at times not wasted, right? I think we're so much like, I'm waiting forever. I feel like I'm gonna miss it and so forth. But you think about the relationship that you're going to be in for the rest of your life is so important. You better invest in yourself, because in all honesty, when you invest in yourself, you're investing in the other person, because you're going to give a better version of yourself to them, right? And if both people are doing that, they come together. Now it's the biggest blessing in the world, because they're both getting the best version of themselves. Right. And so instead of coming into a relationship broken, coming to a relationship like can't even figure out things in their own life, now they're coming to you and you're trying to figure out your own life while helping someone else figure it out. And that whole process can become stressful, messy, exhausting, all this kind of stuff. I'm not saying you're going to have everything figured out. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is like that you constantly becoming the best version is so important, because not only will it prove true what I was saying earlier with like after that thing kind of settles down, it's been a little bit, you're really going to see that person is. And if they don't change, then you understand that's who they are, right? Because they may come out the first certain amount of time, they can hold it and come out as a level 10, but it's them acting, right? And then you realize, oh, they may be a level 7, right? And so what the one thing I would challenge every person that does that is, if you can act it, why not become it? right? If you can act for a certain amount of time, then why not just become that? Why aren't you that person? So do what you need to do to be that person, because everybody wants to be it. Just go be it. You already did it for a certain amount of time. Don't change. Just adapt and elevate your standard higher. Don't revert back to what was. Just go to the new, because we all step into it like, I want to be this. I want to be this. Go become that, I think, is the challenge, the personal level. But I think too, on the relationship side, if you're looking from the other space, is seeing it for what it is and seeing if there's any disalignment. Is it just talk? Is it just to try to get me? And then there's nothing on the back end that's going to back that up. But those are a few things. I mean, I keep going on and on, but I think those are, I mean, anything that same thing for you. Was there anything in that space of singleness that you're like, okay, obviously we've talked about before, we worked on ourselves a lot before, which I think is what helped so much. Just be a caveat to everything else, just kind of stimulating so quickly, because we were in that space already. But is anything else that you would say?
Well, and I'll say this, and I feel like we slightly disagree on this, but we don't, because I think it's rooted in the same thing. But a lot of what I try and share about when we got into a relationship was, yes, for years I had been preparing, and we're always preparing for something. It's just, are we preparing to succeed or are we preparing to fail? And so there were obviously pockets of time that weren't perfect, but I was still learning, and it was still a preparation mode for when I did meet you. And it wasn't actually, and maybe it was just a coincidence with timing, and there are so many things that came into play that made me realize that this was a God thing. But one of the understandings I had was I let go of being the perfect person. And that was actually when I feel like I was able to attract somebody in, because the perfection was a protective mechanism for me. It was, oh, when I'm this and when I'm that, and when I can fit this mold that I have in my head that I know that I'm going to get to it sometime, but I'm not giving myself a justified amount of time to do it. I realized it was just me trying to keep people away. I wasn't even giving the chance to be loved, because I wasn't willing to love myself where I was at. And so when I had that big aha and I said, okay, I don't have to be 20 pounds less, and I don't have to have the perfect job that pays me the perfect amount to do everything, and I don't have to even have my own apartment that I love. And there were so many things that fell into place once I let go of the expectation that I needed to do something, or that, I had to have a time frame. It wasn't that I wasn't still consistent. It wasn't that I wasn't still growing. It wasn't that I wasn't still doing all the things that I know I need to do. I just wasn't putting a time frame on when I was going to see all these results, because the results were going to come no matter what if I stayed consistent. But when I put a time frame on it, I was just blocking people out. A lot of that is just like, there is this whole, movement of like, you have to unconditionally love yourself. And I truly believe that self-love is a healer, and that's a necessity when coming in a relationship, because you can only love somebody to the extent that you love yourself. However, it's not the pre-qualifier. Like, you're always going to be learning how to love yourself deeper. And it's actually in a relationship with Taylor that I've been able to look at my wounds and create a deeper love of self, because there were wounds that were created from relationships. Everything is relationships. We're all in relationships with everything, and you have a relationship with the barista, even if it's you see them 5 seconds a day. Like, relationships are a part of life, and the one where you fall in love is the one where the deepest healing begins.
Good point. I think that's that's good for sure. So I agree completely. I mean, basically with anything I'd say, it would just be rehashing what you just said. So listen to what you just said, essentially. I guess we can kind of go into more of the dating aspect if you want. Yeah?
Yeah, for sure. Because, we're not going to talk about this, but I think we should talk about it. How do you feel about dating apps?
Dating apps?
Yeah. Because you never had one, right?
No. And it's funny. I got told to be on them all the time.
Christian Mingle. Farmers.com.
Sure. I don't know. I didn't even pay attention to him.
Cupid.
Is that even one?
No.
Oh. I have no idea, but never happened to go on it. So Thankful I don't have to.
You know, and I know some great couples that met on dating apps. I have a theory that it's essentially just people looking for validation. And I can say that because I think even when I got on it, I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't the only person in the entire world that was single. But you never do anything with it. And it's never actually I think most of the time you're not going to find a solid partner. I think the time that you spend on a dating app, you should actually just put your phone down and be like, who am I? What am I doing right now? Instead of what is everybody else doing? And taking that time, whether it's 5 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, just to work on yourself. And it's more likely that when you do that, you'll be at a Trader Joe's and you'll run into him or her. And
right. I do think it would be in that essence of how let's say dating apps can work. Essentially, is I think the practicality of what you just said is is valuable. Is the idea of okay. Because most of the time from everybody that I was around, it was scroll. You're always on a dating app.
Yeah, we're overwhelmed by options as well.
Right. And so what ends up happening is you're always on it and you're spending so much time trying to find what's perfect for you right now instead of working on yourself to find someone that you truly want to be and become, because that's what's going to be attractive. Right. I think, like you said, the validation aspect is we're looking for someone to affirm that we're pretty. We're looking for someone to affirm that we're, a good person, that we're dateable, right? There's all these things that we're looking to affirm. And it's not saying that's not bad. That's a part of life. But I think sometimes in that process, dating can become exhausting, because when it becomes exhausting, it's because you're trying to fulfill those things. And those things aren't going to be fulfilled. They're not going to fulfill you if it's just to satisfy those circumstantial or short-term needs, if you will, in your mind, rather than truly becoming who you want to be, surrounding yourself and becoming and building out a relationship you really want around who you really want to be with. With that being said, dating apps can be an option to find those people 100%. I think where it can become, a problem is if you spend more time on a dating app than you do on yourself. Right? Because what ends up happening is all that free time you have, or the spaces or pockets of time, it's just spent on, oh yeah, they're pretty, they're cool, they're great. Oh, I love what they said. If that's all your time spent, that's just you looking at things and trying to be oh, that's cool, that's great. And then you have to go on those dates, right? If those end up coming out. So those hours of your day, and you're just living life without ever growing yourself. Then over time, you haven't spent any time with you. You haven't spent any time becoming a better version of yourself. And so, like I said, I agree. I think dating apps can work. I just never used them. I mean, I'm not saying I'm opposed to them. I think they're great because it allows you to connect with people that you probably never ever see and connect with. And you're oh, it's great. We can see where it goes. But I think not at the expense of you spending time and understanding and growing yourself.
Yeah, well, think about it. Oftentimes people are spending hours at a club or at a bar on Friday and Saturday night, and then they're spending an hour or 3 on a date during the week, and you're spending an hour, setting up the date by talking to people on Hinge, and all of a sudden you've got 8 to 9 to 10 hours of all of this time that could have been spent on just trying to figure out who you actually are and what you want and what you're going to bring to the table when the right person does come along. But we get so fixated on the options and going on all these dates and doing and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that we can get so overwhelmed and consumed by things that are just a waste of time. The person that you're going to date, whether it's for life or for an experience, that person's going to come to you no matter what. And just filling in the gaps is typically a sign that you're just trying to fill a void of loneliness.
That's a good point. So the point is you need to recognize what it is and be upfront in those situations when you're dating, whether it's just going to be feeling that void of being lonely and you want a friend versus someone you're going to date. And being intentional with that, with the other person in that relationship of what it's going to be, because it can be very confusing, right? And so if it's a friend, then great. You guys can go have fun. You can do those things because life gets busy, life gets stressful, and you just want to just hang out and just relax for a little bit with someone that's, whoever it is, right? And you just want to hang out and just kind of be fun a little bit. That's great. That's awesome. But I think in being clear on that, especially if it is going to be dating, because I think friends can turn into that too. So there's that there's a nuance of that is very, it can go either way. But I think it's a tricky subject because one, with the dating app, there's both sides make so much sense. It is really strictly the person and how they operate and how they do things, because you can have the best of both worlds on both sides. I'm just speaking from experience of my side of what I've been through and kind of seen, and I've also seen the other side of it too. So I know it's great. So I'm kind of mixed on which way it can go. The one thing that I would say with that I can't say for sure is make sure you spend time on developing a better version of yourself, period, whether you use them or not. Because if you use them, great. You still have to be a better version of yourself if you want to attract something better. Mm-hmm. So that's what I would say with that.
Amen. Hallelujah.
Thank you, Jesus.
Okay, well, let's go into the next point of, I think when dating you, and this is something from my perspective and you can give your perspective, relationships and dating have changed so much that there are a lot of games involved, and there are a lot of like, oh, he texted me, 3 hours later, so I'm going to wait 6, and he didn't say this, so I'm going to hold off. And it's this constant back and forth, and there's no more clarity. And I think what I loved about you is that, after our first date, there was clarity. I knew that you wanted to go on a second one. And then after that, there was clarity. And it wasn't until like the 4th date that you waited a little bit to see if I was going to reach out. Right. Mm-hmm. But I was always like, I always trusted that you were going to be clear about what you wanted too, because we when we got into our first and second date, we were clear about the fact that, in not a weird way, maybe it was the 3rd date, that we didn't want to waste time, and we respected each other enough to say, hey, like, if I know that this isn't going to go that way, like, it's no hard feelings, it's just not for us, and I'm going to, let you know so that we can walk away from this. And, thankfully it never turned into that. But I think a huge thing about relationships is this clarity, and nobody wants to be clear anymore, because clarity forces us to be a little bit more vulnerable. Because all of a sudden we have to share with a stranger, something that we've met a few times, hey, like, this is what I'm looking for. This is where my heart is at. This is kind of what I want. Like, where do you stand? And this opportunity to be clear and be vulnerable, creates the problem that, oh, I'm afraid I might be rejected. Right. So in fear of being rejected, we actually reject them, and then we never create anything of it at all. No, I agree. That's a great point. And I think the first piece to hit on with that, obviously, is the whole rejection piece of ties into, which we'll get into at some point, with identity, because you have to truly accept yourself before you can be willing to you don't need the approval of someone else to accept yourself, because you'll never accept yourself if you don't approve yourself first, right? And so the other person is just affirmation for what you should already know, right? But I think the key with that and being clear on whoever it is, usually it should fall in the guy's hands, in my opinion, just because they're setting it's a pursuit. Correct, right? And they should be setting the stage for that. And it doesn't always have to be that way, but I think it is. And there has to be clarity. And I would challenge the guy to be clear, to man up and do it, because that should be your role. It doesn't have to be, but I would say challenge you to be that way. Just being clear, because one, not only does it help everything in the relationship, but it allows the other person to feel okay in the act, and they're not having to be stressed out or go through the crazy eight, if you will, of the emotions of like, where are they standing, where they feel, and they're that space instead of being able to be present. Because if they're present, you get to see them. They're not trying to play a game. If you're clear, the game is literally in your court, and you're dictating how it goes, right? So if you're being clear from that standpoint, you don't have to play the game as much. Rather, you're literally playing it in the present, rather than trying to figure, okay, well, if I say this, then this could lead to this. Like, it's not, that part gets thrown out when you're super clear, like, okay, this is what we're doing. And there's not ever guessing going on. And when there's no guessing, you don't have to stay in your head, right? Tony Robbins has a huge thing. It's like, if you're in your head, you're dead. And I think it's really important, because when you verbalize and you kind of explain where you are, what's going on, you don't have to explain all, like, let me say this first, is like, you don't have to explain all your feelings in the first date. That's not what I'm saying. Like, oh my gosh, like, you're amazing. Like, you don't have to do that. Let that unfold, because... Or like, even say what you want, like, down to because no one's going to be like, oh yeah, no, I hope this kind of turns into a a marriage and some kids. Definitely don't say that. But like it's so funny because it's like that's what people like. What do you know? That's what people want for the most part. At the end of the day, like you're dating for a future,
right? I think with that is because once you say it, you can't go back, right? And that's the part of clarity, because just because you feel something doesn't mean you're committed to those feelings with that person, right? And because once you say it, it's really hard. I mean, for example, if you say you love somebody, it's really hard to take that back, right? Or once you say whatever, it's really hard to take it back, positive or negative. I mean, we can understand that even outside of relationships. But so when you do say it, because I think one thing is like when I'm saying clarity, you think you have to talk. You have to say exactly where you are. Sometimes clarity isn't saying nothing either, right? And talking about something that may be coming, and because you're not, for example, like, well, granted, you can do it both ways, but so when you do speak, you are clear because now you're a man or woman of your word, and that's clear. And so then now you don't question anything else that they say. That's clarity in itself, right? But also too, in the aspect of the beginning phases of what's going on, like we're going on a second date, going on a third date, where are we going? This is what I'm feeling, so forth. Explain those things. And you can do it a lot of times by not necessarily explaining it, but even asking questions to the other person, which I think why the question is such a big deal. We talked about of how that can bring up real concepts, real feelings, real thoughts, because now you start to understand the way they think about certain things that are actually beyond surface level. It's not like, hey, how's the weather? How's the work? You know, it's beyond that. It's like how there's a lot of different nuances to it. But I think in that dating process, it is important because it allows both people to get on the same page. And when they're on the same page, they don't have to not be present because they're trying to either protect themselves or they're trying to figure out, are they playing a game with me? Because if they're playing a game with me, then I have to play the game too. And then no one's being themselves, which the whole point of dating and know somebody is to get to know who they are. But if they're both playing the game, you're like, I'm not sure, is this really him or is he just saying this because this should be the right thing to say? Or it's so easy to step into that because we're taught that. And we most likely know what to say for the most part, or like what we should do. And that's where it goes in, like as time goes on, you start to see, was it just because he should do it and it's actually not who he is? Or is it, oh, that's who he is and I love that, right? There's a difference there. So I think that would be the piece of dating that I think is important.
Yeah, definitely. And I also think that it's not that it's easy too. Like there's always going to be a challenge to it. Like, you know, it's also not fun to reject somebody. And I do not believe in ghosting at all. Like, ghosting should be canceled completely, you know, and it's hard because you have to tell them that you're not interested, but it's so much better. And it leaves a person feeling like, you know, most of the time if I've, you know, let somebody know, they're usually appreciative because they're like, hey, like now I'm not overthinking, like you were clear.
Correct.
And even though the clarity was hard, it did something for the other person. And yeah, maybe they're a stranger and you're not interested in them, but I still think that it's the right thing to do. And you would want the same. So right. I think that that's important.
One thing before you keep going on that is the reason that's important too, and you have to remember on a personal level, you think, oh, I'm not going to tell them because it's going to hurt their feelings. Really, it's you being so uncomfortable with having to tell them. It's actually better for you to tell them, but you're too afraid to step into that. So it's not actually, it has nothing to do with them, it has everything to do with you.
Yeah.
Right? It's you put it on them to make you feel better about yourself, because the clarity is actually going to help both of you, but it's hard to be clear in that situation and saying, you know, I'm just not interested in you. And then you can tag it on however you want. You can talk about all the positives you see in them, but that's just not what I'm looking for, right? Or that's not what I want. The timing is not right. Whatever you want to say, being clear allows both of you to be free in that space and not have to guess, like, what did I do wrong? Like, what did it, because you start to think that way, right? Especially if you kind of like that person. It's like, what did I do wrong? What did I say? Like, and if there's not any clarity there, or they just ghost you, it's like, well, then now I'm second guessing, like, am I even dateable? Like, it goes back to the whole thing.
I will say too, and I just want to touch on this really fast because I talked about it a little bit today on my TikTok, but essentially, like, with our relationship when we first started dating, there is this constant, like, story that women are told, especially because of the Disney movies and the fairy tales and all this thing that you're supposed to meet them, you're going to know. And for some people, sure, maybe that's how it is. But in the real life, if you've gone through experiences that have been love bombing or trauma bonds or somebody, ending up in a toxic relationship or whatever it may be, and you're already aware because you've done the awareness piece that you have not had a very healthy, functional relationship. You could show up to a date with an incredible guy or a couple dates, and he could be healthy and know how to treat you and be your partner, something that you could spend the rest of your life with, and you will miss it because you don't have the awareness that you've confused this spark with what's actually just a ton of anxiety, or you've confused the ups and downs in the games with this like love affair of what you really want, and you'll miss, you have the possibility of missing the greatest thing in your life because you didn't do the work. And that's why the work is so important. And just be cautious. Like, you're supposed to feel peace and content and like you're home. And I remember even when you said that to me, I was like, that's what I want, is that like that safety. And sometimes we look at the safety or we look at the peace that we feel in the first relationship or the first date, and we misconstrue it with, that I don't have that feeling, which is really just like anxiety.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, like, it goes back with commitment over feeling, because commitments create feelings long term, right? But if we live by a feeling first, the commitment's not there, then it's just feelings come and go, right? And if you're trying to create something that lasts, you can't build it on something that comes and goes. You have to build it on something that is tried and true no matter what. And then because of that consistency, because of that, whatever it is, continues to grow on you, you have feelings for it. Because ultimately we all want something, but we all want the spice of life too. And then I think that is where you find the uniqueness of who you're going to be with, because they add the spark, but at the same time they add the safety. And that's the perfect mesh for whoever that is for you.
And I will say the spark obviously grew very strong. Right. And it was built on a foundation of God and peace and, like I was saying, safety and vulnerability and conversations and the same vision and alignment and, so many things. But that grew into what feels like the purest, most deep love that is meant to be created between two people that we found and that we created and that we're committed to and, constantly working on. So I think that that's important.
I agree. I think it's vital to any lasting relationship, because if you're not committed to it from even the little things that you do, those feelings will fade. But if the commitment's still there, you have trust in the feeling that it's creating, will never leave.
Yeah. And it's not that you won't have questions during the relationship. Like, you'll have questions, but you'll have the commitment too. And so the questions won't make you waver if the emotions aren't there. If you're already committed and you've committed to the reality and the truth of who you are together, then there's no reason to step away or lose, the most important thing in your life.
100%.
Based off of a feeling.
100%.
And we talked about this off air, but on our first date,
I don't know what she's about to say, so we'll see how it goes.
on our first date, so Taylor paid, which I agree is the right thing to do. But we had this conversation. He was like, I don't know. I think we could have split it. You didn't say that, but something like that. And I thought,
this is a good topic.
And like at first I think we were disagreeing, but now we've come to an agreement. But we're going to share both sides. So here's why I didn't offer to pay for our first date, or to pay half and half. Well, it worked out, didn't it?
It did.
Okay. First of all, it was going so good. So I had this idea in my head of like, I've heard so many different things from different people. If I say, hey, like, I'll pay for half, I didn't want it to signal two things. I didn't want it to signal that I wasn't interested. And then I also didn't want it to be like this demasculating thing where I wasn't giving you the chance to, dare I say, quote, take care of me or like have that opportunity to show me that you were able to do that. Now looking back, yes, I probably should have offered. I think that's the best way to do it. But I still think that if you offer, and I know you'll say offer authentically, but if you offer, I think if the man is interested, or even if he's not interested, I personally think he should pay no matter what, because if you invited her to dinner, you're paying.
No,
okay. You invited her to come to dinner with you.
Do I get to explain?
No, absolutely. Podcast over.
No, I agree with you. And this is my point with where even the somewhat disagreement was in the beginning, was the idea of, one, obviously, even if she did offer, I would have never let her pay. Right.
Yeah.
And so, but the gesture of an authentic willing to pay shows a lot of ways, guys, that where that is, because unfortunately, it's not every girl, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it can feel, I guess, that they're being used, right? What are you laughing?
Because we talked about this off air, and I just think I agree. I'm sure that happens, but I know that the ladies are going to agree. Women don't really eat on dates. Like, we just don't. Like, I would rather go to Trader Joe's and make myself a little meal and sit in my apartment and eat alone and watch some sort of show, like 100%. I would not want to get up, put makeup on, an outfit, jeans probably that are tight, go to dinner and eat a Caesar salad and then pay for half of his filet mignon. I'll pass. Hardcore.
That's a great point.
And that's why I'm saying, like, it's just so funny. Like, I think if I'm asked to dinner, you're paying, point blank. And if you don't, I hate that I'm going to question you, but I'm going to question.
No, I think you should. That's the thing, is it's in my head. I would never let a girl. I don't think I've ever let a girl pay for a meal.
Yeah, how many girls? I'm just kidding.
But I would never let that happen. Even though I think, oh, cool. It'd be when someone does offer, it's like, okay, cool. Like, I'm not. It feels like it's together rather than it feels different. And
it does give the man the opportunity to say, no, I got this. And there's a good beauty in that. I think it's good to watch them say, oh no, I got this. Like, please let me. I loved this dinner.
Right.
And so I did change my mind. I do think that you should always offer. But I do think that the man should still always pay. And
right. And I think one thing too, especially early on, especially if you're younger too, and you don't have, like, if you're not, let's say, financially well off, if a girl, especially going to nice places or just in general, if let's say the guy in situation, like, if they're spaced out on the heavy dates as far as going to restaurants in terms of like hanging out, which may be more fun, and maybe because it's just expensive, right? It's not that it doesn't like you, right? And so, because think about it, it can add up pretty quickly, especially if you're going on frequent ones.
Yeah.
And so that can be something to not necessarily raise a red flag, but it could just be one of those things. And when you offer, it allows to take the pressure off sometimes guys in that situation. Now, as you get older and you have actual money, then it's a little bit different because it's not as big of a deal you're going through because you have the finances to do that. But still, I think the idea that, okay, I'm willing to legitimately to a guy gives off like, oh, okay, like that. It's a good thing to know rather than it just being one-sided. Now, I'm never going to let someone pay, even if they offer. Like, but it's nice to know that they will. I think is where I stand with that.
Well, you know what? Next time we go to dinner, I'll offer. I'm just kidding. We're pretty good at that.
Yeah, no, I think so. So
I do my best. Take care of my man.
You're doing all right. Just kidding. You're doing a great job, man.
Anything else that you want to touch on?
No, I think because without going into a bunch of other things, we obviously want to keep these tight.
47 minutes.
Right, but on concepts.
You were like, "Will we have enough to talk about?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, you're chatty Kathy." Well,
okay.
I know, but I love it. I love it. You got so much to say.
So anybody in comments of this, say who's more of a chatty Kathy, me or her. I'd love to see what you guys say.
I would love to see that.
Just saying. We'll see.
We'll see. Okay, and then we'll talk about this later.
And we're out.
Okay. Well, that was good, babe.